Today's psalm picks up where yesterday, or Tuesday's psalm that is, ended. Tuesday, we were looking forward to God's judgment, looking forward to the day that God would make things right. In today's psalm, the psalmist writes from the perspective of God's victory. We don't know what victory he has in mind specifically, but he's describing an occasion when God has come through and granted victory in a glorious, incredible fashion, such that the people could not help but attribute the success to God. So if you're ready, let's look at Psalm number 76. Yet again, another psalm of Asaph, as he thinks about who God is, what God has done, and how we ought to respond to him. Psalm 176, start at verse 1. In Judah, God is known. His name is great in Israel. His abode has been established in Salem, his dwelling place in Zion. There he broke the flashing arrows, the shield, the sword, and the weapons of war. Glorious are you, more majestic than the mountains full of prey. The stout-hearted were stripped of their spoil. They sank into sleep. All the men of war were unable to use their hands. At your rebuke, O God of Jacob, both rider and horse lay stunned. But you are to be feared. Who can stand before you when once your anger is roused? From the heavens you uttered judgment. The earth feared and was still, when God rose to establish judgment, to save all the humble of the earth. Surely the wrath of man shall praise you. The remnant of the wrath you shall put on like a belt. Make your vows to the Lord your God and perform them. Let all around him bring gifts to him who is to be feared, who cuts off the spirits of princes, who is to be feared by the kings of the earth. And so, before we were anticipating victory, hoping for, longing for rescue, now we've seen it. And the picture, of course, here again for us is not that we're at battle right now, but that the God who can rescue his people, the God who answers prayer, the God who defeats the enemy, both 2,000 years ago, 2,800 years ago, is the same God today. And so let's go through this psalm quickly in the next several minutes, and let's see what it is that the author has to say about God's victory and how we ought to respond to it in our own day. In Judah, the largest of the tribes of Israel, but in reference to the southern part of the kingdom, Judah was remaining after the northern tribes had been taken into captivity. In Judah, God is known. Philosophically, we know who he is. Theologically, we understand him. But also the picture of knowing is knowing intimately. In Judah, God is known. His name is great in Israel. Recognized, established, magnified. Hallowed be thy name, Jesus says we ought to pray. God's abode, his house, if you will. We know God is not physical. There is a house that symbolizes his presence. His abode has been established in Salem. Salem is the ancient name for the city of Jerusalem. If you go all the way back to the book of Genesis, when Abraham met Melchizedek on the road back from rescuing Lot and others from the various kings, he met Melchizedek, who was the prince of Salem, the prince of Shalom, the prince of peace. And so God's abode has been established in Jerusalem. His dwelling place is in Zion. Zion is often a name for Jerusalem itself, but it also refers specifically to the mountaintop there in Jerusalem where the temple was constructed. And so his abode is there in Jerusalem. His dwelling place is in Zion. From there, it says he broke the flashing arrows, the shield, the sword, the weapons of war. God didn't even have to leave his home to defeat the enemies, whether the arrows, the shield, the sword, all those weapons of war, they were as nothing as to God. He doesn't worry about the worst our enemy has to offer because it's nothing to him. And as a result, the psalmist praises. Glorious are you, great, such that we can't help but ponder God's majesty. You're more majestic, he says, than the mountains full of prey. Anybody who's ever been to the Grand Canyon can attest to you that moment when you first see the canyon and it takes your breath away. It's more than just a big hole in the ground. It's more than just a bunch of rocks. It's an impressive, amazing display of God's power on earth. And just in the same way, if looking at the Grand Canyons or gazing across a beautiful landscape of mountains takes your breath away as majestic, Purple Mountain's majesty we sing about, how much more has the presence of God, the reality of who he is, take our breath away? More majestic are you than mountains that are full of prey. The stout-hearted, the enemy, they were stripped of their spoil. These are strong warriors. They'd come, they raped, they pillaged, they burned, they'd taken all they wanted, and yet, in a fell swoop, in one moment, God strips them of their spoil, takes away what they thought was the prize of victory, and they sank into sleep. It's not the idea they laid down their head and went to sleep. They died. All the men of war were unable to use their hands. Imagine an army full of soldiers with arms that were paralyzed, handcuffed hands behind their back, unable to fight. That's the essence of anybody who wants to go to war with God. It's like fighting with an unarmed man. You cannot defeat God. No matter how strong you are, no matter how great your weapons may be, God will not be defeated. In fact, in case you didn't pick up on it, at your rebuke, O God of Jacob, both rider and the horse lay stunned. God has wiped out the cavalry. But you, speaking of God, you are to be feared, to be respected, to be dealt with cautiously and carefully. You are to be feared. As he asks a rhetorical question in verse 7, who can stand before you once your anger's aroused? Yeah, we might be able to stand before God and think we're talking tough, but once God has had enough, no one can stand. He can blow horses and riders down. He can deflect arrows in mid-flight. Remember back in the 80s, some of you, how amazed we were with the Patriot missile system that, wow, all of a sudden we now have a battery of missiles that can take other missiles out of flight. And we saw those in effect in the first Gulf War. To God, all those things are nothing. Who can stand before him when his anger's been aroused? The answer, of course, is no one. From the heavens, you uttered judgment. From his throne, God said, no, guilty. The earth feared and was stilled when God rose to establish judgment. The earth stopped in its track when God rose to save all the humble of the earth. And so here are the powerful and the mighty again, taking advantage of, destroying the weak, victimizing the broken. They seem to have gotten away with it till God says enough. And even the earth knows better. Surely, verse 10, the wrath of man shall praise you. Our best anger is but a pale imitation. Compared to his, ours is nothing. The remnant of wrath you will put on like a belt. Their best efforts, God laughs at and scoffs. Verse 11, how do we respond to all this? Make your vows to the Lord your God and then perform them. Do it. Respond accordingly. Place your faith and trust in him and then follow through. Let all around him bring gifts to him who is feared, or to him who is to be feared. Let those who promised follow through. Him who is to be feared, who cuts off the spirits of princes, who is to be feared by the kings of the earth. And thus he is the King of kings. All the greatest and most powerful can't stand in his presence. They might huff and they might puff, but at the end of the day, he's the one who blows them all down. And so it's a good reminder for us on two accounts this morning. One, to take God and his wrath seriously. Just because you think you're getting away with your sin, know that you're not. God knows all things. He is, in a sense, keeping track, keeping score. And one day, even though he may appear to be slow to judgment, the New Testament author says, he will deal with it. Just as he dealt with Tyre and Sidon, just as he dealt with Sodom and Gomorrah, so too will one day he deal with your sin. On the other side, if perhaps this morning you're feeling victimized, you've been taken advantage of, maybe by the system, maybe by the world, maybe by Satan, you think. Don't give up hope. God, who can defeat the enemies with a wave of his hand, if you are his people, he's on your side, and he will ultimately guard you and protect you and restore you jealously. You're his, and he will care for you in his time. And so while we wait on God, know that we wait on him who is coming, and he who is coming, who will come victoriously, and he'll come for his own. May you find comfort in that, and may it give you peace to face whatever situation you're facing this morning. Keep reading your Bibles, and keep praying to the God that it describes.